West Coast Supermutants. These types of supermutants began with the Master, who wanted to right the wrongs of humanity by creating a whole new breed of human beings. Using a strain of FEV called FEV2, which was sourced from the Mariposa military base, the Master successfully created what would be the foundation of his powerful army called the Unity. West Coast supermutants are physically imposing, had thick green skin that was resilient to radiation, and they were difficult to kill. But more importantly, they retained a meaningful level of intelligence. Despite looking like mad brutes, they could speak, form social structures, hold opinions, and even question the cause they were enlisted to fight for, which made them more than just expendable soldiers. Make no mistake though, there were many hostile and mentally unstable figures among the ranks. What the Master didn't count on was that because of the extreme exposure to FEV, the supermutants were actually sterile, which meant his plan was doomed from the very beginning. And so, after the Master was defeated in 2162, the Unity collapsed and the remnants scattered across New California. The more violent ones refused to stand down and became kinda like raiders. However, the more rational ones took a completely different direction. Some joined the NCR Rangers, integrated into human settlements, or even built new communities from scratch. Broken Hills was one of those communities, co-founded by the supermutant Marcus, and it stood as a working example of what human and mutant coexistence could actually look like. But the West Coast story didn't end there. Years later, the Enclave excavated Mariposa between 2236 and 2237, using captured miners from Redding as slave labor to dig through the old base. Without any protective equipment, those workers were exposed to the FEV still sealed within. So a second generation of West Coast mutants emerged from this, and unlike their predecessors, these ones came out significantly less intelligent on average, which was a direct result of the uncontrolled conditions of their creation. West Coast supermutants appear across Fallout 1, Fallout 2, and Fallout New Vegas, spanning nearly a century of in-universe history. Nightkin supermutants. If the West Coast supermutants were the Master's army, the Nightkin were his special forces. Created from the same FEV2 strain at Mariposa, the Nightkin were handpicked from the ranks of the Unity and given something no other supermutant had access to: stealth boys, devices that rendered them nearly invisible. Using this technology for years made them physically distinct from every other strain of supermutants. Instead of green, their skin turned into a deep, dark blue that fit their name very well. And honestly, it just makes them look cooler. However, that wasn't the only side effect, because the prolonged exposure to stealth radiation made the Nightkin mentally unstable, and this was slowly dismantling their ranks from the inside. After the Master's defeat, the Nightkin scattered just as the rest of the Unity did, but because of their deteriorating mental state, reintegration to any kind of stable community was nearly impossible for them. Like in Fallout New Vegas, a large group ended up at Black Mountain under Tabitha, a Nightkin with severe schizophrenia who had convinced herself she was a prophet and established what she called the state of Utobitha. But all of that was just her broadcasting increasingly unhinged propaganda across the Wasteland, while holding a ghoul mechanic named Raoul hostage to keep her radio equipment running. Others made their way to Jacobstown under Marcus, where Dr. Henry had been working on developing a cure for their deteriorating mental condition. But progress was slow, and by 2281, the community was already fracturing. Now, if the Courier decides to help Dr. Henry complete the cure, Nightkin from across the Wasteland would flock to Jacobstown, and it becomes a genuine haven. However, if they don't, the Nightkin completely scatter, their condition worsens, and Jacobstown falls apart. Capital Wasteland supermutants. When most people picture a supermutant, big, aggressive, barely capable of forming a sentence, they're probably picturing this strain. Capital Wasteland supermutants were created through something called the Evolutionary Experimentation Program, an FEV derivative developed and used inside Vault 87 in Washington, D.C. And from the very beginning, what came out of that process was fundamentally different from what the Master had built on the West Coast. These mutants came out with lime green skin, not dark green, with red patches stretched across their bodies where the muscle was visibly straining against the skin, as if trying to break through entirely. But the more significant difference was cognitive. Capital Wasteland supermutants were borderline feral. They captured humans, dragged them back to places like Vault 87, and used them to make more of themselves. A cycle of expansion driven purely by instinct rather than ideology. But what made them particularly dangerous was that they didn't stop growing. Capital Wasteland supermutants continued to grow physically with age, getting larger, becoming more powerful, and even less intelligent over time, eventually crossing into something else entirely. By the time Fallout 3 takes place in 2277, they had been waging a war of attrition against the Lions Brotherhood of Steel for nearly 2 decades, and were considered one of the most serious ongoing threats in the entire region. In the entire game, only 2 non-hostile Capital Wasteland supermutants exist, which says everything you need to know about this strain. Commonwealth supermutants. These supermutants were created by the Institute using an FEV sample they acquired through means that was never fully clarified in the game, but the Commonwealth supermutants weren't created intentionally as soldiers or as part of some grand vision for humanity's future. They were simply a byproduct. You see, the Institute's primary research at the time was focused on developing Generation 3 synths, and the supermutants that emerged from their FEV experimentation were essentially the unwanted results of that work. Experiments that outlived their usefulness and were essentially dumped into the Commonwealth rather than dealt with properly, which tells you a lot about how the Institute felt about the outside world. But what they had created was something new entirely. Commonwealth supermutants share the dark green skin of the West Coast strain, but their muscles grow differently, less defined, uneven, almost unnatural in the way it develops, as if the FEV was working with inferior source material. And in a sense it was. After all, these mutants weren't part of any real controlled program. They are also somewhat intelligent, capable of forming their own tribal structures and communities, but they share the tendency of the East Coast strains to grow larger and less intelligent with age. They also carry a particular attitude toward humanity that feels almost ideological. They see themselves as superior to humans, and view violence as a form of retribution against the people they once were and the society that created the Institute in the first place. But what makes the Commonwealth strain particularly unique is that it's the only one where a cure has actually been developed. Well, to be more specific, it's for one super mutant only named Brian Virgil. He was a former Institute scientist who had escaped into the glowing sea and mutated himself in the process. He was somehow able to create a cure and turn himself back into a person, but he needs more research and time to generalize the formula because it's only for one particular strain of FEV. Still, it's better than nothing, and it gives the super mutants of Fallout 4 a little bit of hope. Appalachian supermutants. The Appalachian supermutants have the most deliberate and cynical origins of any strain in the series, and it's all thanks to a man named Thomas Eckhart. After the Great War, Eckhart had seized control of the Enclave's White Spring bunker in Appalachia, with one obsession driving every decision he made: finishing the Sino-American War completely by launching the region's nuclear missiles at whatever remained of China. The problem was that the automated launch system required the threat level to reach a critical point before it would authorize anything. So Eckhart decided to manufacture one, and that's how the Appalachian supermutants got started. In June 2080, he sent a science team to the abandoned West Tech Research Center, where pre-war FEV experiments had been conducted, and ordered them to recreate a full mutant outbreak. What emerged was widespread, violent, and nearly impossible to contain. The Appalachian supermutants share most of their physical traits with the Commonwealth strain: dark green skin, oddly shaped muscle mass, and the same tendency to grow larger and less intelligent with age. After the initial outbreak, a researcher named Dr. Edgar Blackburn continued FEV experimentation in the region, which only increased their numbers further and made an already dangerous situation significantly worse. Like other East Coast strains, they are accompanied by similarly mutated creatures. Mutant hounds and floaters move alongside them, and behemoths have been encountered in the region as well. One notable exception to the general profile is Dr. Blackburn himself, who mutated under different enough conditions to present traits that set him apart from the rest of the Appalachian population. Appalachian supermutants appear in Fallout 76, where they represent one of the most widespread and consistently hostile factions in the entire game. Behemoths. Life as a supermutant is pretty rough and violent, so when they actually grow old, it's a special thing. Behemoths are what happens when a capital Wasteland, Commonwealth, or Appalachian supermutant keeps aging without dying first. They are the oldest supermutants of their kind, and physically the most extreme result of what uncontrolled FEV exposure can produce when given enough time. They tower between 13 and 20 feet tall, making them some of the largest creatures in the entire series, and they are no longer capable of anything resembling intelligent speech. The only sounds they produce are monstrous roars. That's because whatever cognition exists in their earlier years has been completely consumed by the process of continued mutation. It's worth noting that this is an exclusively East Coast phenomenon. West Coast supermutants, created from FEV2 at Mariposa, are not known to grow into behemoths. Something about the strain or the conditions of their creation prevents that kind of runaway physical escalation. But for the strains born out of Vault 87, the Institute, and West Tech, the trajectory is always the same. These monsters appear in Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76. Friendly anomalies. If you're a wanderer in the Wasteland, a good rule of thumb to follow is that supermutants are not at all friendly. Across the entire series, the overwhelming majority of supermutants encountered in the wild are hostile, territorial, and largely uninterested in coexistence with anyone who isn't one of their own. So the ones who break from that pattern entirely are worth paying attention to. Marcus is the most prominent example, a first-generation West Coast supermutant and former member of the Unity. Marcus spent decades after the Masters' defeat building communities where mutants and humans could actually live alongside each other, first at Broken Hills in New California, and later at Jacobstown in the Mojave. He appears as a companion in Fallout 2 and a significant character in Fallout New Vegas, and across both games he represents something genuinely rare, a super mutant who chose diplomacy over dominance and never stopped believing that coexistence was possible. Then there's Fox. A Vault 87 super mutant, Fox survived the mutation process with his mind intact, something that almost never happens with the capital Wasteland strain, and spent over 2 centuries imprisoned in an isolation cell by his own brethren because of it. He taught himself history, literature, and science through a terminal connected to the Vault's mainframe, and by the time the Lone Wanderer found him, he was one of the most articulate and measured characters in the entire game. He appears in Fallout 3 as an optional companion, and represents the single clearest example of what the capital Wasteland strain could have been under different circumstances. And then there's Uncle Leo, the most wholesome super mutant in the game. Also a Vault 87 super mutant, Uncle Leo was exiled from his own kind for trying to convince them that there was more to existence than fighting and killing. They didn't listen, so he left, and spent his days wandering the capital Wasteland, unarmed, pacifist, and genuinely glad to meet anyone willing to talk to him instead of shooting at him first. He's a random encounter in Fallout 3, which means there's a good chance most players never met him at all, and that feels like the most Uncle Leo thing that could happen to him. Fun fact, you can actually get Uncle Leo to meet Fox if you have him as a companion, and he'll react about the same way you'd imagine. Completely wholesome. Frank Horrigan. Frank Horrigan is technically a super mutant, but calling him that feels like it's missing the point by a significant margin. Horrigan was a Secret Service agent, a massive, physically imposing man who had been serving as the personal bodyguard of President Richardson. The Enclave had him shipped to the oil rig immediately, where he spent the next 2 years heavily sedated, operated on, and studied by their scientists while the mutation ran its course. What they did to him went far beyond what the FEV alone would have produced. Colonel Curling used him as a testing subject for modified strains of FEV, and the Enclave's scientists altered his physiology so extensively by adding cybernetic enhancements. He was then sealed inside a custom-engineered suit of power armor, the only super mutant in the series to actually wear one. The armor wasn't just protection, it was life support, continuously injecting him with drugs and stabilizing agents that were the only thing keeping him functional. The result was something that surpassed every other super mutant ever created. Bigger, faster, stronger, and more resistant than any other member of his species, Horrigan sat at 999 HP, the maximum possible in Fallout 2, carried 2 weapons that existed nowhere else in the game, and could attack multiple times per round with enough force to end most encounters before they properly started. And despite everything that had been done to him, he remained loyal, devoting himself to the cause even to the very end. And that's every super mutant type in Fallout explained. Which one's your favorite? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Fallout lore dives.